Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Editorial Roundtable podcast. We have the entire team sitting around the virtual table, including Jen Marston, who basically is in the hurricane zone. Jen, are you okay right now?
Oh, I'm fine. It's not a hurricane yet, but we are getting some pretty severe weather down here in Nashville, Tennessee. Still 80,000 something houses without power, and they say we might not get it back for a week. So,
well, in pandemic times, that barely makes a blip on the national news front. But it sounds like you're living it. But I'm glad everything's okay. You have power, so we can record podcasts. And the first story up is one that I wrote where you've yet to publish, but we've all been playing with this thing called Magic Cook, which is a text bot-based recipe assistant put out by the good people at Whisk. I tried it, and the idea is basically you put in whatever random food you have in your fridge, you text it to a number, and then it'll spit back a text with a link to a recipe with most of those ingredients, maybe a few extras. I tried it out; it worked okay. Catherine, what'd you think?
Yeah, I like this concept a lot because I think right now all of us are trying to reduce our grocery trips. So anything that can help us get a little more creative in the kitchen and get out of cooking rut while using what we have is great. I typed in about 5 or 6 ingredients that I had, like some cabbage, some ginger, some jalapeno, and they gave me a recipe for this thing that had a bunch of other ingredients in it that I didn't have. So I was like, this is not maybe super helpful. As someone who cooks a lot, I think I could be inspired by it and just sort of adapt it to my own parameters. But I think that if I didn't cook very much, I would be like, okay, well, this isn't helpful because I don't have green beans and I don't have dark sesame oil, whatever. So maybe down the road, I know this is a new application for them. They could introduce something with a little bit more versatility. You could swap things out, or they can note sort of substitutions you can make for different ingredients if you don't have them. I
like the simplicity of it. The fact that you don't have to download an app. You just text. It's a conversational text-based bot, which I think is kind of cool. You're right, though. It doesn't necessarily build an entirely new recipe based on ingredients. It might take what you have and search its database and recommend one that has some of those, but you might still have to go shopping. But it's a start. But I think what I like about it is the simplicity. And I also wrote a story about it. And what's interesting is they built this thing in like a day. Mm-hmm. And it became like the number 2 app on ProductCon last week. So you never know what's going to take off. Chris, did you try this? Did you try this little text bot?
I did. And I think it's like others, I think it's the concept is more interesting to me than the product itself, because I put in a couple of different things, and it was I put in like salmon, and I tried to just throw in random things that I actually did have. I said salmon and rice and something else, and it came back with like teriyaki salmon. But again, it included a bunch of stuff that I didn't have, and like teriyaki sauce. Yeah. But to your point, I like the simplicity of it. Like the idea of using the text interface is interesting to me more than like voice even, right? Like being able to throw a bunch of ingredients at, an Echo speaker or a Google Assistant or something, and them coming back at the recipe seems like more of a hassle than just being able to like text and going, hey, this is what I have. What can you do? Because it's so immediate and quick and useful. So I like the idea of it more than the product itself.
Yeah, it definitely feels like kind of and Mike, I think you mentioned this in your post. It feels like a low risk way to just find new recipes. I don't have to download an additional app, which I think you had mentioned is kind of starting to become a bit of a deal breaker for folks nowadays. I would wonder sort of right now, as it is with its limitations, if the quality of, if sort of the simpler the ingredients you're putting into it, the more useful the recipe would be, if that makes sense.
It definitely feels like 1.0. Like I said, they made it in like 24 hours, and it went kind of viral on ProductCon. It's an interesting approach. It's contrasts a little bit with, I wrote about, if you guys remember, Equal Parts Cookware, which is a cookware startup based in New York, where they have a text-based cooking assistant that actually has people on the other end, like actual culinary experts, where you text them and they'll actually tell you, hey, here's a recipe I think you should make for Thanksgiving. And then going back even a couple years before that, if you guys remember, Chef Steps did a Facebook chat-based bot that helped you with this cooking. It wasn't necessarily a recipe recommendation engine, but it's more of a bot to help you guide you along the cooking path as you made sous vide chicken or whatever. I think it's cool. I like the simplicity of it, but like you said, Jen, it probably the more basic the ingredients, maybe the better optimized it is. I try to stump it. I put in caramel and hot dogs, and it gave me back like a hot dog based pastry, but had no caramel in it. So I did stump it.
Yeah. It put me in mind of Plant Jammer, which I don't know if you mentioned that, Mike, but that you do have to download an app for, which I think we can all agree we want to minimize. But the cool thing about it is that it builds a recipe based around the ingredients that you're noting that you have. So basically it will only use ingredients you have, and it'll make you sort of a bespoke recipe that's really simple in a really quick amount of time. So this to me is like all recipes already has a capability where you can just put in your ingredients and it'll suggest something for you. I agree. The appeal of this Whisk app is the text-based interface, which makes it really just easy to do on the go. You're staring in your fridge. You just type in some things, see what you get. But there are companies who are doing that in a more sort of complete manner, albeit maybe not as convenient.
But again, it gets back to the idea of a really simple, like, hey, use your text, because everybody texts, all the phones have it built in. You don't have to set up an account. You don't have to do, because it's not just the app, right? It's like, oh, now I got to get an email and a password and all the hassle that goes along with that. So, what's interesting to me is this came out of Whisk, right?
Yeah, it came out of Whisk. Now that is now part of the Samsung broader innovation hub.
Right. And then you saw them with, with their home fridge. I can't remember the name of it now. Home Connect or Family Hub fridge? Was that
Family
it?
Hub fridge. Yep.
Where it's starting to do things like identify foods that are in your fridge. So you can almost see this sort of going, hey, here's a picture of my fridge. What can you come back with? What do you got?
You maybe if it's all integrated, you say, hey, I have this, or like it kind of uses the same Whisk API, contacts their database based on the images it has of the tomatoes and the formaggio cheese, and then spits out a recipe. So I could see that going that way, Chris. I definitely see that path. So interesting. Like all the stories we're really talking about, the next story is just like the first one, in that it was driven to a certain degree by the current environment we're in under a pandemic, where everyone's basically having to think about pivoting or creating new solutions that are tailored towards the new dynamic. And this next story, Catherine, you wrote about Bellwether Coffee, where they're basically offering potential coffee shops a way to get in with a little lower risk and a little easier on the front end to use their essentially Pico roasters to basically roast coffee on the spot as a way for coffee shops who can't currently serve coffee to maybe survive the pandemic. Tell us about that story.
Yeah, so Bellwether Coffee, for those who aren't familiar, they make these ventless electric roasters. So for those who don't know, which would be many people, roasting coffee actually produces a lot of emissions, which are toxic and kind of nasty. And so often you have to have this big vent or hood installed if you want to start roasting coffee, which means that it's expensive. And most cafes aren't going to start doing it, especially your like small neighborhood place that only has one location. But Bellwether has this new roaster. It's about the size of a fridge, I think. And you can install it in coffee shops quite easily. You just have to plug it in, and it doesn't have all these emissions, so you don't need a vent. So it's a pretty easy solution to just start roasting your own beans. Of course, it is expensive, $75,000 up front, or I think you can rent it for $1,100 per month. And basically, Bellwether is offering 2 months free right now for coffee shops that want to try out the roaster between now and July, which is obviously a time that a lot of places, coffee shops included, are being really dramatically affected by the lack of dine-in orders, especially coffee shops, which, your small local coffee shop has a bunch of people there for social gatherings and people doing work on their computer. I like to go and get my stuff done there. So these shops might need a new revenue source. They're not a Starbucks that's just churning out a ton of to-go orders. So if they can start roasting their own beans and selling those to people who come in the shop or online, that could help get them some more revenue and tide them over until they can open up for dine-in again. And they can also start using their own beans, which could potentially help cut down on some of the costs around purchasing wholesale beans. So it's an interesting idea. I mean, I think Chris in the newsletter, which will come out later, explores it pretty thoroughly. The possibilities here where this could help supplement income for these cafes, especially since you don't need any particular training to use the roasters. It's pretty automated, and it also connects to its own green coffee bean site, so you can just order via the roaster itself, and so it's a pretty easy way for these shops to start selling their own beans, but it's still relatively expensive. And the question is, will these shops be able to actually make enough money to make it worth it after the 2-month trial period kind of expires?
Listen, I've always liked the idea of Bellwether bringing the roasting out to the edge. This idea that a coffee shop can make roasting hyper local and done in your neighborhood. I'm curious about how they've done it the past couple of years. I haven't really been paying attention to how their customer base has been shaping out. Mm-hmm. But I think the idea is a good one. I think if you're a well-known coffee shop in your neighborhood and people are looking to support you, listen, one thing that people aren't going to do is stop drinking coffee no matter what the natural disaster or pandemic is. So it's interesting. Chris, I remember you wrote about them a long time ago. Do you have any idea how they are, how their customer base has been shaping up for the past couple of years? Has it been these small popular coffee shops in different cities?
I haven't actually. The story that Catherine wrote reminded me oh yeah, Bellwether. Because I was really, I was big on them because of the opportunities that they can create, because it's not just like coffee shops, right? Like grocery stores could create their own roast blends, and you could also dial it in to very regional tastes. You could dial in your coffee, and it was also meant for small chains, so that if you had 3 stores in the same city, you could, roast your own beans and get them out without having to ship in beans from a roaster or whatever. It was really easy to create your own line and distribute them locally. But, I haven't, and I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. They raised $40 million last year. And I don't, I'm curious to see, as I explored in the newsletter today, I'm curious to see if any of these independent shops take them up on that. Mm-hmm. Is that what we want from our local coffee shop, which is just to grab a bag of beans?
I mean, it's not cheap, right? It's still not super affordable. If you're a cash-strapped coffee shop, this is a $70,000 machine still. You maybe get the couple months free. So I'm not exactly sure how many people are going to take them up on it. I think the longer term trend of bringing the roasting down at the coffee shop level is cool. I remember, I don't know if it was like this, Chris, when, where you lived in Seattle area, but in North Seattle, 5-10 years ago at Costco, they actually used to roast coffee in the Costco. And I don't know if that was just the Costco around where I lived. Because sometimes Costco's in the Seattle area because it's the home market will do different things that are different than the other markets. But I always thought it's cool. There's something about seeing coffee being roasted and knowing it's roasted right there that makes it kind of cool, makes you want to buy it there.
Yeah, it reminds me of a coffee shop chain here in Nashville that was pretty much the first sort of organic coffee shop that ever came to this city. They've expanded. They have, I want to say, 6 locations around town, but they roast their own beans. And I could see this working for somebody like that. They're not huge, but they have enough success locally to where they might be able to justify the cost of something like this. I feel like it's a great idea over the long term, because I think there is starting, especially with the pandemic, it's just making a lot more people want to get more of their food and beverage stuff locally. I'm cautious about whether most coffee shops would even be able to consider something like this, even with the free trial. I mean, that's very expensive in most places. Most food service places, including coffee shops, are just trying to figure out how to stay in business right now. So it will be, I don't know. We'll see how popular this is.
Yeah. I do think that coffee shops, though, compared to a lot of the other food service places out there, have a bit of an advantage because they're already so adapted towards the to-go culture. I mean, they already have all the to-go cups and cutlery, and people are used to getting a cup of coffee or tea and taking it to go, whereas some other restaurants might really be relying on the sit-down and the tips and that revenue source. So I do think that coffee shops maybe have more of a possibility of surviving the pandemic than perhaps some others, especially since they can run on like a skeleton crew of one or two people. But whether they have the extra income to invest in something like this is a totally different story.
Yeah, and it could be like a local restaurant or like a small food outlet, mom and pop food outlet can get into coffee roasting. It doesn't necessarily have to be coffee shops. I think coffee shops, a lot like it's probably the 80-20 rule, right? Like 80% of coffee shops, like that are not Starbucks, probably struggle from a month-to-month perspective cash-wise. But then there's like, we're all familiar with like the really popular local coffee shop in a given neighborhood or city. There's like one or two of those on Capitol Hill, for example, Catherine, that do really well, that maybe can survive it. It's an interesting thing to watch. I want to keep an eye on it because I'm interested to see where this goes. This next story is kind of like the coffee idea, in that PicoBrew is this popular idea that used automation to bring the very active making something to the very edges. And they did it even in an even smaller way than Bellwether, in that they wanted to bring beer making into the home. I've been writing about them for like 5 years now. We're all pretty familiar with PicoBrew. And like a lot of startups, I think they're being brought to their knees with the pandemic, and they were brought to their really maybe to the end. This past week, I wrote a story about how PicoBrew basically is going out of business. I'd been talking to a few of my sources, and last week they laid off the founders. I just checked yesterday, and Avi Geigner, the CTO of PicoBrew, basically put PicoBrew, his tenure at PicoBrew ended after 10 years, and he's looking for basically a new gig. So it's a sad ending to a story, and I think this kind of the postscript and the analysis of what happened will take a little bit of while. I have some thoughts on it, but were you guys surprised by this? Chris, I know you've been following PicoBrew as well for a long time. Were you surprised that they went out of business?
No, and I think the easiest way to sort of illustrate that is you have a PicoBrew, right?
Yes.
And when was the last time you used it?
It's been like about a year.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Like, it's coming during the pandemic, but I don't know if you could really pin this on the pandemic, right? Like, it's there were bigger issues around it, right? Like, one was the Pico Pack problem, right? As I say alliteratively, which is where it's for homebrewers, but you couldn't really tweak it that much, right? Like, you had to get their Pico Packs. So that sort of, I don't know if it sapped the fun out of making the beer or whatever. But it was also like the first wave of this kind of at-home technology, right? Like, people had never really had, home brewing has always existed, but it's really complicated and messy, and you got to bleach things, and you got buckets and hoses, and you got to watch things, and things explode. And this seemed to take all of that away, right? Like, you didn't have to deal with all that mess. But it was also like the first time, like one of the first wave of machines that really did it, right? Like, I think you could almost draw parallels to the sous vide market, which is where a bunch of people are like, oh, we can finally do this at home. And then once they got it, they're like, oh, I don't really want to do this at home. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think here's the thing: like the subset of people in the world that want to brew beer at home want to create something. By and large, they want to be, show their creativity a little bit. They want to be a little bit of a maker. And PicoBrew, at least the Picos, the consumer ones, are fully automated. That also, like, they're never going to be like Nespressos, right? Like an automated thing that makes something, does it quickly. It takes a full week to make beer with PicoBrew. So I think they were kind of in this weird in-between space where they weren't necessarily enough of a creative outlet for the home beer maker, but also like it wasn't fast enough for like someone who wants to automate beer, right? So it was kind of in that weird spot. They also just had a myriad problems. Like, they just had they owed people too much money. They went into a lot of different offshoot kind of products like coffee that they never were really able to kind of bring to market. And at the end of the day, the pandemic may have just been the final nail in the coffin.
Yeah, I mean, they were built on the back of Kickstarter, right? Like that was how they got all their funding. So and they did it really well. Like you could do case studies around their ability to raise money on Kickstarter. But ultimately, I don't know. People, I think, to your points, it's just, it's in this space in between. Like, yeah, I have a home appliance, but it still takes me a long time. I can't just pull the tap,
Yeah. And I think Mike's point that the people who are making beer or spirits, which I know they did Pico with the distilling and all of that, like those are the type of people that like to get crafty and like to get a little bit messy and don't mind doing it in their garage and tinkering away. They're not necessarily the people that just want to like put a pack in, wait a week, and boom, your beer's ready. In that case, they'll just go to their local brewery and like get some nice locally brewed beer that's just as good and fresh. So I just think that the market wasn't there.
What we got to watch now is like, sorry, but like the DrinkWorks just came out with the ability to brew beer at home, or not brew beer, but make beer.
Yeah.
Where they sell beer pods and then it's basically distilled down to a beer essence. And then you put it in a machine and you hit the button and then it spits out, it reconstitutes it with water. So, there are like Nespresso like devices out there now for beer.
But then like buy a can of beer? That makes no sense to me. The cocktail part makes sense.
I and I'll say one of the Marston family's favorite memories we laugh over is, a gazillion years ago, hearing these explosions in the middle of the night coming from the kitchen, and it was all the homemade beer that hadn't been done correctly exploding under the cabinets. It was like ridiculous at the time, but now it's a good laugh. But it's that sort of, if you're home brewing anything or home making anything, the experience is sort of wrapped up into that. And I don't think something that's automated really gives a person that experience. And then like the rest of you have said, but nor does it make it so easy for the average consumer that it takes no effort. So, yeah.
Well, we can see like with Beer Maker, if it ever gets out of, it got walloped by the COVID-19 because Beer Maker was somewhere in between, right? Like it was a countertop system that automated everything, the brewing, the fermenting, and it lets you experiment. Like you could throw anything in the hopper. Literally, you could go out into your backyard and pull up grass and throw it in just to see if that affected the taste. So I'll be interested to see how that, what happens with that afterwards, if it ever gets out of production.
I mean, PicoBrew learned the lesson, I think, but probably too late. At some point, I think in 2018, they started talking about being able to create your own pods and sending you basically these open pods that you can put your own grains in. So they realized that people didn't want to be captive to their ingredient ecosystem and wanted a little more creativity. But it was probably at that point just a little bit too late. They started to stumble in 2018. They had to cancel Kickstarter. But there should be case studies written about this. I might have to write one myself. But speaking of case studies, I think this pivot by Yokai could be one that could be a fun one to do microanalysis on, Chris. Yokai, the ramen robot company, is an interesting one. They were up at Smart Kitchen Summit last year, and they were spitting out ramen, and people seem to like it. And this week, or just recently, they became a ramen meal kit company. Tell us about this story.
Yeah, so Yokai Express is an automated vending machine. There are 20 of them, I think, around the Bay Area. You can see it at the SFO Terminal number 3 and at the Sony Metreon if you're ever able to go out in public again. And you do the thing and you pay like 10 to 12 bucks and out comes a delicious bowl of ramen. I'm no ramen expert, but I thought it was fantastic. And then, but the problem is that all these automated vending machines are in high traffic areas like office buildings and airports and corporate campuses. And guess what aren't open right now? Offices, airports. Airports are open, but there are fewer people, right? Like all these high traffic areas aren't so high traffic anymore. So the company has sort of, I won't say pivoted, but they've sort of added, right? Like their COO runs restaurants, right? They have a Michelin star chef who created the ramen menu for them. And they've decided to create ramen meal kits that are being delivered around the Bay Area. So can't get to the robot? Well, we'll just disassemble it and send it to you. And They sent me a box to try out. I tried 2 different ones, and they were both really good and almost as equally important. My 9-year-old son loved them as well.
So the ramen, does it come in like a form that isn't like you'd get in a top ramen, this kind of square, like compressed ramen noodles? Like
it is not different? A brick.
It's not a brick?
Yes. So I don't know how they ship it around the Bay Area, or how the delivery works for that, because obviously they're based in the Bay Area, so they can literally just drive it to someone's house potentially, right? Like it's a totally different model as opposed to sending it up to me. But all the ingredients are in their own bags, pre-portioned. The broth was in its own bag. The noodles are cooked, but they're still like they're wobbly. So you basically are reheating them for just like you're just throwing them in to boiling water for like a minute. And then all the other ingredients are cooked and they're in their own little plastic ramekins. You boil the noodles for a second, then you heat up the broth and throw in the ingredients, and like there was meat. So you throw that in there and you then just put it all in a bowl, and it works. It's super easy to put together. And it is, I tried a black truffle one and a spicy kimchi, and they were both very different and very delicious and super easy to make.
What's interesting is these hardware companies who had a food component are leaning in heavy to the food delivery side. Sous Vide, the cooking robot company for the home, has a 4-chamber cooking robot. Pretty expensive device. I would imagine the pandemic has caused them to struggle a little bit in terms of selling those. They've leaned heavily into selling their basically their food delivery. So they do what this is called a protein box. Chris, you've probably seen that. I get the email marketing all the time. Yeah. And they do a lot of social media marketing. And so it looks like to me they're leaning heavily into that as something to monetize during these pandemic times. And it looks like the yokai pivot was even bigger because they didn't do any sort of consumer facing product, and now they are. So that was an interesting pivot for me.
Yeah, I highly recommend it for people in the Bay Area. You can go to the shop on the Yokai site and order it for delivery, something a little different than restaurants, but it's still kind of restaurant quality food. They still have to make it. But so, this was something, their main robot, their main business is creating automated robots, vending robots, but maybe they'll keep this going post-pandemic if enough people take to it.
So I'm a big, noodle nerd, going to Japan like every year, the last couple of years. My son, who I took to Japan with me last year, you guys got to meet him, super big ramen nerd. And so we live based in Asian grocery store, and I go there and there's a whole aisle of amazing different types of ramens, and it's really fun. So I even think the brick of noodles is still pretty good by and large. Are you guys big ramen fans? And I'm talking about ramen outside of your traditional top ramen. I would imagine you guys are also noodle nerds to a certain degree.
Noodle nerds. I like that. I mean, yeah, I think I'm a noodle nerd. I love ramen, love noodles. I don't usually buy the instant stuff because I'm it's not good for me, blah, blah, blah. And I can just make regular pasta easily. But yeah.
Are you making your own ramen from scratch, Catherine? I can see you doing that.
I have done that, but I'll tell you, it takes a long time. Making the broth takes about 8 hours. So it's not an everyday activity. But yeah, maybe it's because we're in a Seattle area, but even going to my Safeway or local QFC, they often have the fresh noodles in either a refrigerated section or something like that. But assembling all the components is what's so hard about ramen. There's the meat, there's the seaweed, there's the egg, there's the broth, there's the noodles. And so even if I can get all of those pre-made, I'm probably not going to purchase them all, cut them all, and then put them all together on an average night. But something like this kit makes it actually doable.
Is ramen hot and pretty popular in Nashville? Are there any good Nashville ramen spots?
I mean, there are a couple. I would not call it a hot spot for ramen, which I feel like I personally need to change. So that's my new crusade. No. I mean, I'm definitely, my years spent in the Bay Area and a little bit in New York as well, turned me into a noodle nerd. It's definitely more difficult to find it down here. I have tried my own from scratch before. I will echo what Catherine said. It's a neat process, but it's really time consuming, even when components are pre-made. So there is, I mean, not that they're going to be sending a kit to Nashville, but the idea is really appealing. And I feel like it would also just be, I'm thinking about somewhere out here where there are plenty of parts of Tennessee that people have probably not even ever tried ramen except for the stuff in the bottom shelf of the grocery store. So it could also just be an interesting sort of way to introduce more consumers to the idea of here's what good ramen actually is.
You see, I feel like Nashville is exactly the type of place they should be shipping, like basically a ramen desert.
Yeah.
You can get good food in Nashville, but probably ramen isn't at the top of the list. And they probably got to figure out how to make sure it lasts, hopefully without adding a ton of packaging and dry ice. Probably impossible. But like, I feel like shipping to consumers in places like Nashville, like could be an eventual business for someone like Yokai.
Anything's possible. The whole world's upside down.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not a special person, so I didn't get a Yokai special kit like Chris did, but hopefully they can maybe make those available. And,
you are.
But I'm looking forward to trying it. But for now, I'll just have to stick to making bread and growing.
Go on.
Yeah.
What are you growing? Oh, your seedlings.
Yes, I'm growing little seedlings in a jar.
Cute.
I've grown my first batch this week, and they're actually pretty good. I had a salad with it. Although my wife is making fun of me for growing them. As she probably should be.
I can see that.
All right, guys. Hey, well, thanks for getting together on a podcast, talking over the news of the week, and enjoy your ramen, Chris.
Oh, I did.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.